Welcome to the latest episode of USC Trojans Primetime Live here at the Voice of College Football. I'm Matt Zemek. He's Ethan Inman. And so it's the middle of May, almost a Memorial Day weekend. And so what would there be to talk about? Well, if the USC-Notre Dame football series is on the verge of maybe ending, I'd say that's our number one topic. I'd say that should dominate the conversation. So that's going to be our main story tonight here on the Voice of College Football. And so, Ethan, we're going to dive into the details, going to peel away the layers of the onion. Just before coming on the air, I saw Ryan Karchi with a story from the Los Angeles Times saying this is Jen Cohen taking a hard line in negotiations with Notre Dame. So people thinking this is Lincoln Riley being a softy, afraid of competition. Ryan Karchi is reporting. Hey, Ryan Karchi, in my mind, very solid, reputable USC beat writer for the LA Times. He doesn't throw Molotov cocktails. He's a nuts and bolts reporter. He just reported in a pretty straightforward, direct way. Jen Cohen is taking the hard line in negotiations here. So, in terms of conspiracy theories about Lincoln or other figures, this really seems to be Jen Cohen's issue, and Jen Cohen is taking it upon herself to try and put USC in what she thinks is the best possible position. Now, we're going to debate that. We're going to litigate that. But let's just start with the significance of Jen Cohen, by all appearances, being the person who's really taking charge of this and who is kind of driving USC's hard line in this Notre Dame situation.
Well, I'm going to start off in defense of Jen Cohen because I think from the same outlet, LA Times, I saw something a little bit earlier in the week that the whole reason why is because USC wants the way that college football playoff automatic bids work qualified a little bit. And, we saw that a lot last year, a really heated debate about whether or not records should matter more, whether or not conference records should matter more, whether or not top 25 wins should matter more, all these things factoring in. Obviously, Notre Dame is a completely different beast in terms of that scenario, given that they don't have a conference. They kind of determine basically their own schedule every year. And so the article went on to say that USC is trying to extend the rivalry by 1 year, and Notre Dame isn't really interested in any short-term extensions. They want a long-term extension. So from that perspective, I guess it kind of makes sense. I can see where Cohen and some of these other USC bigwigs are coming from, that, you want to give your program as good of a chance as anybody to get into the college football playoff, and you don't want to give rivals, longstanding rivals like Notre Dame, a better chance of getting into the college football playoff. So, holding out on the historic rivalry, it makes sense from that perspective, that very unemotional, very strategic perspective. But that's kind of the extent of the defense that I'm going to give it in this situation, because honestly, I think that, and I said this a couple weeks ago when the rumors started circulating, I think that backing out of the Notre Dame rivalry is pretty cowardly, to be honest with you. I think that, in the midst of stronger USC teams, in the midst of like the Pete Carroll dynasty, this wouldn't even be a conversation because USC would be winning a lot of these Notre Dame games. I think, to be honest with you, a lot of the reason the conversation has intensified is because that USC's had so much struggle against Notre Dame recently, and that, USC seems to want to position themselves with some less difficult out-of-conference games so that they can have a better record and, kind of walk into the college football playoff. And I just think that that's not what USC football is about. That's never what USC football has been about. And there's a real identity, whether, USC fans like it or not, that has arisen for USC out of this USC Notre Dame rivalry that they'd be kind of shedding if they moved away from it, which is, we don't back down from anybody. This is, I think there's double-digit national championships between these two programs combined. So These are two of the historically the best college football franchises going back and forth. And, it's must-see TV. It either happens in the middle of October or Thanksgiving weekend, depending on where the location is. It's historically been a fixture of the college football schedule. And I understand from a purely strategic perspective, like I said, if you're Jen Cohen, you're looking at the new college football playoff rules, which are a little murky. You want to more easily get your program into the college football playoff, how that makes sense. But you just lose so much identity, you lose so much history, and you lose so much about what college football is about, and you lose so much about what the USC program has historically been about, which is we don't back down from anybody. We weren't backing down when we joined the Big Ten. It was obvious that was going to be a tougher thing schedule-wise year in and year out. Obviously, the last year of the Pac-12 was a gauntlet, but that was the exception rather than the rule in the last 10, 20 years of the Pac-12. So, we weren't exactly running from anybody when we did that. So why we would run from anybody now, I think it's just sad. It saddens me. And I really hope that, both sides aren't holding anything back here and do everything that they can to keep this rivalry going.
Yeah, so again, a lot of layers of the onion to peel away here. So this is not a conversation where you can kind of say everything that is to be said in 1, 2 or 3 minute block. This is requiring several layers. So here's the first layer. One is, obviously Jen Cohen wants those automatic qualifiers, and to a certain obvious extent that makes sense. Like, let's get those 4 Big Ten spots guaranteed before we commit to a long-term deal. I think we can all understand that. But I think the skepticism of Jen Cohen and questioning why she's taking such a hard line in negotiations is this. Ethan, you and I would agree, I think most people watching our show here at the Voice of College Football would agree, that AQs or not, regardless of how many AQs, automatic qualifier spots, are in this playoff, we pretty much all agree this playoff is going to 16 teams next year. Like, the SEC is not going to settle for just 3 teams. The SEC definitely, after last year's humiliation, the SEC will want more bites at the apple, more teams in the field. That's why the SEC is, pursuing this plan of having 2 play-in games, 3 versus 6, 4 versus 5, which, by the way, is really smart. It's something I advocated for on a show with Mark Rogers, in the winter. But this is going to 16. And so the question, Ethan, is just how much should USC and Jen Cohen, so this talking specifically about Jen Cohen, since she's the one taking the hard line in negotiations with Notre Dame, just how worried should Jen Cohen be that, if we have a 16-team playoff, we really need that 4th automatic qualifier in the Big Ten to feel comfortable? Is that really the hill you want to die on, Jen Cohen? Is that really such a sticking point that you're going to take a hard line in negotiations with Notre Dame? Like, that to me is the first point of discussion here. You're USC. Are you really going to spend so much time worrying about a 4th automatic qualifier and being like a number 14 seed? Like, we need that number 14 seed. As you would say, that's not USC. That's not the culture of this football program. That's not the culture of this university. It really seems Jen Cohen, in her, as we've both said, understandable desire to protect USC's interests in its relationship with the Big Ten, which was the big investment, and that wasn't even something Cohen did. Like, that was Mike Bone putting Jen Cohen in that situation, but obviously Jen Cohen's trying to adapt to it. We get that. But really, Jen, do you need to be that worried about a 4th Big Ten spot and a number 14, 13 seed? Like, we're not SMU. We're not, like, for SMU, it meant everything to get into the back end of the playoff like that. USC shouldn't be worried about a back end seed in a 16-team playoff, right, Ethan Inman?
Exactly. I mean, you perfectly said what I was about to say. If USC is a program that has competed throughout college football history. It's not like Nebraska where they were competing 40 years ago for national championships. USC has competed for national championships in every era of college football. since basically the beginning of the sport. So everyone's reaction to this number one recruiting class in 2026 is, this is the norm. This is what should be expected. This is not out of the ordinary for us. This is not a super special, achievement. This is what should be happening because Southern California has the best college football talent, college football prospects of anywhere in the nation. And USC is USC with all of the resources that USC has and with all the history that USC has. So if that's going to be our attitude towards that, that should also be our attitude towards the rivalry. I'm sick and tired of, there's so many like USC creators on Twitter and social media too that are in support of canceling the rivalry to, like you said, like squeak into the 14th seed of the college football playoff. It's a weak move. And I'm tired of all the excuses. I'm tired of we have to travel to Indiana potentially a second time in the schedule. Like maybe you should have thought of that when you decided to move to the Big Ten. Like these are all problems that we've created for ourselves. And honestly, I think that they're good problems to create. I think that they're problems that showed back in 2022 when we made this move that we wanted to be competitive, that we wanted to take on some of these top teams like an Ohio State, like a Michigan, that we were tired of playing, a half full Arizona State and a half full Washington every year, at these stadiums with, and I'm giving Washington a little bit too much flack. Maybe Washington State would be a better pick, but these schools where the students don't really care about the football team and, they're very mediocre year in and year out. Like we wanted to play these historic blue blood programs. We wanted to play in the Big House. We wanted Penn State to come to the Coliseum, and we should, in the same vein, invite the kind of competition that Notre Dame brings. And so I'm sick and tired of the excuses and all of the just very silly, just the very silly like reasoning and cowardly, like, let's squeak in as that shouldn't be the expectation. Like you said, we should expect to compete for national championships. And if not, we need to have a serious conversation about admitting that we're not at the top of the college football ecosystem anymore, which I don't think any USC fan is going to admit. So if we're not going to admit that, then we should be fully behind any move that seeks putting us in primetime competitive games as much as possible.
Okay, next question, next layer of the onion to peel away, because there's so many avenues that we have to explore here. So we're just going to patiently deal with them one by one here at the Voice of College Football. The next layer to this, Ethan, is, and you alluded to it a little bit in an earlier answer, but let's just tackle it head on right now. If USC beats Utah in the Pac-12 championship game, Caleb Williams doesn't get hurt, and the Trojans finish that win, and they make the playoff, are we sitting here at the Voice of College Football having this conversation about USC and Notre Dame potentially ending their series? If USC makes the playoff a couple years ago and under Caleb Williams, are we having this conversation right now, Ethan?
Probably not. I think a big reason why, like I said a couple minutes ago, a big reason why we're looking at this rivalry even potentially ending is just the amount of success that Notre Dame has had compared to USC in recent years. And also, obviously Notre Dame is set up to have some more sustained success than USC is in terms of just the way that the college football playoff is set up in terms of the revenue that you receive, relative to each round you advance. And Notre Dame, obviously, being a conference-less school, gets more of that share of that revenue, whereas someone like USC, they're splitting the revenue between all the schools and all of that stuff. And just generally, the ecosystem that college football is currently in. Marcus Freeman's a great coach. Notre Dame fans have every reason to be optimistic, which USC fans aren't going to want to hear, but it's true. The one time that USC kind of had Notre Dame's number was that year in that 2022 season when Caleb Williams had a signature Heisman performance and they beat them in the Coliseum. So, and then the argument starts looking a little more even. Sure, Notre Dame made the college football playoff semifinals this year, and honestly, kind of a year where there was no clear top team. People thought that it was Ohio State at the beginning of the season, and they ended up finishing on top, which is something that we talked about a little bit last week. But it's not like they were consistently there. I mean, this is a team that lost to Michigan, a very, very mediocre Michigan team in the last game of the season. And, so it's not like, and scored like under 20 points. So it's not like Ohio State had the smoothest, undefeated sailing to the playoff championship. In the playoffs, they were very good. But getting there wasn't necessarily the smoothest of sailing. So it's not like, years in the past when there's an Alabama or a Georgia that just blew through everybody. And maybe, in a year like that where there's a more dominant team, maybe Notre Dame doesn't make it that far. So you're not, and then you have USC who makes it at bare minimum to a college football playoff semifinal if they win that year, because that was before the 12-team expansion. That was when it was still 4 teams. I assume that they likely get beat by, whoever ended up being the number 1 seed that year. Or maybe if they play number 2 seed TCU, if that kind of works out, maybe it's a competitive game. But again, minimum college football playoff semifinal. And basically finishing in the top 4. You have Notre Dame finishing in the top 4 this year. You kind of call it even maybe. And you also acknowledge the fact that, there's some advantages for Notre Dame in this current era of college football, but there's also some advantages for USC given, we've talked to a great extent on this show about how NIL's coming into the picture is an incredible asset to USC in terms of the just way that they're able to recruit athletes across sports, not just in football. So maybe you count it all even at that point, and you are looking at this as more of something that will be evenly split in the future, which I think they should be looking at anyway, given USC's 2026 recruiting class. And if you have confidence in this coaching staff and you have confidence in these recruits, then you should be considering it an even rivalry, and a rivalry that you can feasibly regain dominance in the near future. But it just seems like they're not looking at it that way, which is a real shame.
You really hit on something at the end there, that because USC has this awesome incoming recruiting class for next season, that makes Jen Cohen's squeamishness and hesitancy that much more puzzling. Because if USC is on the way back and as reflected in recruiting rankings and getting our NIL house in order, the things that didn't happen in 2023 and 2024, but now it's all coming together. That just doesn't it's hard to wrap the mind around why USC would be if not necessarily would be worried. It's certainly USC is projecting the appearance of being worried. That's for sure. Whether USC is worried, we could debate that forever, but it's certainly the appearance of being worried. If you have the number 1 class in the country, why are you projecting the appearance of weakness? That really doesn't make any sense here. Among all the things that don't make sense, that's near the top.
Yeah, because talking about it in terms of PR is a good point to bring up, because whether Notre Dame is also not wanting to continue this so they can schedule some weaker opponents is not something that we obviously know about, but Notre Dame is at least putting out the appearance that they want this rivalry to continue. The athletic director has made comments to the media, and every report that we've gotten has indicated that Notre Dame is seeking a more long-term deal. So, and they are in a more of a position to do that kind of thing based on the year that they're coming off of, but they're doing a lot better managing the PR machine as well. So it's just not a great look for USC, and I hope that they can shore things up for sure.
All right, another layer of the onion to peel away here is, when USC and UCLA joined the Big Ten, obviously that was an earthquake. That was a seismic development. It was on the heels of Texas and Oklahoma going to the SEC. So there's another huge shakeup in the landscape. And of course, a lot of people outside South Bend, Indiana, outsiders, not the insiders at Notre Dame, but people on the outside felt, this is going to finally lead Notre Dame to the Big Ten. And that's something that never made sense to me, because as you said earlier, Notre Dame gets the whole pie. Notre Dame gets all revenues for its various achievements by being independent. So and the Big Ten's larger. So that means you're splitting the pie if you join the conference with more teams. So that just never made sense to me. But the point about bringing this up is, when USC made the decision, and again, in fairness to Jen Cohen, this was not her move. This was a Mike Bohn move. Bohn put Cohen in this position. But so we're relitigating not a Cohen decision here. We're relitigating a Bohn decision. Also, Carroll Folt as well. It seems that USC needed to bang the table for certain concessions when it joined the Big Ten. And I know that the Pac-12 was awful. George Kliavkoff, Larry Scott, and people were fed up. I was fed up. I don't know if you were. You probably were. And USC wasn't getting the uneven revenue share that it certainly deserved as the bell cow money creating program in the Pac-12. So USC had its nose rubbed in the dirt, and so getting out of the Pac-12 was a priority. I'm not trying to say it wasn't or it shouldn't have been. However, if you are going to go to a new conference and you do know that there are going to be various headaches, shouldn't Mike Bohn and USC leadership, when they were planning this Big Ten move, shouldn't they have insisted on certain things being an automatic part of their new association with the Big Ten? And one thing you alluded to earlier, was scheduling and the grind and the logistics. One thing I mentioned a couple weeks ago on this show here at the Voice of College Football was, why in the world is USC flying to West Lafayette to play Purdue in September and then flying back to South Bend in the middle of October? That is dumber than dumb. It makes absolutely no sense. Look, if USC couldn't get something common sense in stone, in writing from Tony Petitti, the Big Ten commissioner and the conference at large, if USC couldn't insist on and get a guarantee that, hey, if we have to go to Purdue or we have to go to Bloomington to play Indiana, we're playing Notre Dame in connection with that, either the week before or the week after, to not be able to get those kinds of concessions and now being worried about, the grind of the travel and the logistics. Well, again, this is not Jen Cohen, it's Mike Bohn, it's also Carroll Folt. But shouldn't USC have driven a harder bargain a few years ago? If you're going to go through the headaches of this move and the headaches that we're seeing right now, headaches that would not have existed if USC was still in the Pac-12, shouldn't USC have pounded the table and absolutely insisted on getting certain guarantees that it has not gotten to date in the Big Ten?
Well, it certainly seems like it. I mean, and to give USC credit, the only thing that I've seen about scheduling in terms of some of the reporting that's come out is that USC has tried to get the scheduling to move. It seems like USC wants to move the Notre Dame game to a little bit earlier in the season so that you can have I think, which bodes, two advantages for USC. Obviously, you can pair it with a game like the Purdue game, which you want to have earlier in the season so it's not snowing. So that, again, that kind of makes sense. And also, it helps with this new college football playoff setup. You can overcome early season losses now with good late season performance and squeak into the playoff. So in that sense, it makes sense, because if you take a loss at Notre Dame in September, it hurts a lot less than taking a loss against Notre Dame in November or December, or November or October, excuse me. So in that sense, I get it. And that doesn't seem to be on USC. That seems to be on Notre Dame, who wants to keep it, at the same times, which again is tradition. It's either in October if you go to South Bend, or it's on Thanksgiving weekend if it's in the Coliseum. That's historically how it's been. And I do give Notre Dame a little bit of credit for trying to protect the history if that's what they're after, and they're not trying to make it more difficult on USC, which they could be doing. We'll never know for sure. But yeah, there's a lot of things that don't make sense. I mean, it was one of the questions too from the beginning has been, while football is a sport that can charter these flights across the country, and the basketball's kind of are. What happens when like baseball has to play Rutgers, it's so there's all kinds of scheduling issues that didn't seem super well thought out. And we saw it in the basketball schedules this year too. I mean, both basketball both basketball teams made multiple trips to the East Coast and had, East Coast teams making, but East Coast teams only had to make the one trip. They hit UCLA, they hit USC, and then they left. So it's like, and I get that there's more schools on the East Coast in the Big Ten than there are on the West Coast, and all kinds of things like that. But it's definitely something that they're still figuring out. I hope that it's just growing pains, and I hope that the conference can figure some of these things out, and USC does have some power to try to, figure these things out now, even though it wasn't figured out ahead of time. But I don't know. I hope that they can figure it out. And it's unfortunate that, it has come to this, but it doesn't, at least the Notre Dame game scheduling specifically doesn't seem to be USC's fault, but there's a lot of other factors that they could have figured out, obviously.
All right. Another layer to all of this. A lot of people are going to say, well, hey, why doesn't USC just play Notre Dame and then you schedule 2 other cupcakes in your 3 non-conference games? Problem solved. Well, one thing that John Wilner of the Wilner Hotline, the San Jose Mercury News, longtime Pac-12 watcher, now he covers the various former Pac-12 schools and their new conferences, so that obviously includes USC. One thing he mentioned earlier today being Wednesday, we record our show, USC Trojans Primetime Live, every Wednesday at 10 p.m. in the East, 7 p.m. Pacific. So one thing John Wilner said earlier on Wednesday, May 21st, was that the Big Ten and the SEC want to do their non-conference series, so that the Big Ten and SEC teams can get a nice little Power 4 win on their resume, which looks so much better than an FCS cupcake, such as the Citadel, or for a lot of Big Ten teams schedule MAC programs, the Mid-American Conference. So the Big Ten and the SEC have been discussing their series. So like that is kind of a monkey wrench that gets in the way of the plan for USC or any other team to have your one really big and difficult non-conference game, and then you schedule 2 cupcakes. USC would have Notre Dame and then the Big Ten SEC series. So that's another impediment. So Ethan, in terms of just scheduling in general, not so much USC specifically, but scheduling in general, I wrestle with these questions all the time. I've been covering college football for a living for nearly 25 years, and obviously a fan since the early 1980s. So all my life, I've been, passionate about this sport. So I think about these things all the time. To me, Ethan, one thing that could perhaps deal with the USC Notre Dame worries, but would also help the whole of college football, is that we need a revolution in scheduling and in terms of the architecture and flow of the season. And my specific thought along these lines, want to get your view of it. I think we need to start the season in early August now. I think that, if you start the season in early August, what does this achieve? A lot of things. Let's start first with ESPN gets an August full of college football inventory, Fox as well. So there's money to be made if you do that. But the other obvious product of starting the season in early to mid-August, and you have 3 or 4 more college football Saturdays, is you can have 2. Every team would have at least 2 off weeks, and some would have 3. Actually, if you started early enough in August, every team would have 3 off weeks over the course of the full season. And the thought process there, it's not very hard to understand. With a 16-team playoff, presumably starting next season, 2026, you're asking every playoff team to win 4 games on top of the conference championship game and your 12 regular season games. So you'll be asking every team to win 17 games to win the national championship. So if you're going to have 17 games, which is really NFL territory in terms of workload, you might as well spread this thing out. Why keep it scrunched up and bunched up? You might as well expand the calendar, which, it's a very NFL-like thing to do. Own the calendar, occupy more real estate, but you're giving players more breaks. So some might say, oh, why are you making players play in summer? Well, first off, if you're going to be playing in August, you're going to be playing night games. All right. So like that would be part of this. It would be a heavy night schedule. And you could also do some really fun things like an all-night college football marathon. Like you play a game in like Corvallis at 6 p.m., you play a game in Seattle at 10, and then you play the Hawaii game at 2 a.m., and then you could play someplace in the East or Midwest at 6 a.m. when it's cool, when hot temperatures are not a factor. So you could do some creative TV things. But really, Ethan, the larger point is, I think it's time to expand the calendar, not the number of games, because that's happening already with the 16-team playoff. Like, that's not my idea. That's not something I wanted. I thought 12 was pretty good, and I thought 8 actually would work pretty nicely. I'm not really a fan of 16. So this is not, the 16 teams in the playoff is not my thing. But if you're going to have a 16-team 4-round playoff, you might as well create a longer stretch from August through November so that players get these built-in breaks before you're going to be asking them to play a conference title game and then 4 playoff games in December, January. And so if that happened, I'm thinking about this nationally, but USC versus Notre Dame, you would be able to have an off week every year, either before or after the USC Notre Dame game, which would address the specific concern of the grind and having to play the Big Ten and Notre Dame. That could be a way for USC to address the Notre Dame question, but I'm really thinking about benefiting the sport of college football as a whole. I think it's time for a revolution in scheduling. Your thought?
I largely agree. I have one counterpoint that I'm going to briefly bring up, which is, I think I'm only thinking about it because I just graduated from college. But if you start in early August, there's not going to be really any students around, which is probably part of why they haven't considered this in the past. USC historically starts around the week of August 20th. And then like a week later is the first football game. They kind of let students get settled in for a week. And then if they play a week 0 game, it's the next week. Maybe it's the following week, depending, whatever. So I think that is something that you kind of lose as students being on campus. And, at schools like USC, that is super important because unfortunately, I don't think a lot of students would come otherwise because USC, especially the student fan base, which is something that I've spoken about in my time and have tried to make changes to. The USC student fan base is pretty fair weather, to be honest with you. And I really wish that they were more involved and more excited about it and not just in it for the party and actually in it because they cared about the football. So I think that that's something that you lose at a lot of universities. I don't think that's going to matter for a lot of SEC schools like, Alabama, Tennessee, where the students are going to show up anyway, even if, it's a month until classes start, especially because they have a lot of in-state students. With USC, you're getting a lot of international students, you're getting a lot of out-of-state students. So a lot of, the student body isn't even in state, let alone on campus. So I think that could be a potential issue with moving forward with that idea. But I do think that largely the benefits do outweigh the detriments. I'm thinking about student athletes and, getting them started on the season a little bit sooner and having those breaks, like you said, would probably allow them to handle their academic workload a little bit better, which is kind of nice. And I also think that the weather component is something to think about. If you get some of these games done in August, and like you said, at night, if we're being smart about it, you're not worrying about playing games in, late November when it's freezing cold. You can get some of the Indianas and the Rutgers and all those schools out in the way in August rather than playing them in, a time when there's a risk of snow or just general cold weather conditions. And, USC doesn't want to be a school that's scared of cold weather conditions, and neither does any school. Nobody wants to have that reputation. But I think every school, even the schools that are comfortable in cold weather, will admit that, it's the cold weather brings a challenge, and sometimes it's entertaining. It's fun to watch on TV and stuff, but there's no football player that would say it's easier to play in the snow than to play, and when it's 60, 70 degrees out. Obviously, that's an easier situation to play football in. So, I think that there are potential benefits, kind of like the ones that you laid out. I just think that the main losers in that situation would be the students, which is a problem for some campuses anyway. Like UCLA is on the quarter system, so they start their season long before students come to campus, and it obviously shows in their attendance because nobody goes.
I was just about to say, how many students are banging the doors to see UCLA football?
Yeah, I mean, not a lot go during the season because it's so far away from the campus as it is. But it becomes even worse when you're not on campus at all, getting like the shuttle over to the Rose Bowl or whatever. So, I mean, I just worry that's my biggest worry. I worry, and it's unfortunate that I have to worry about that with USC students, but I really do. I worry that if USC was playing 2 or 3 games at home before students got to campus, that USC is already struggling to fill the Coliseum. It would become even more of a problem, especially if these are the Georgia Southerns of the world. You're going to be looking at an even emptier Coliseum, which is really unfortunate, but it's a reality that we have to deal with in this kind of day and age of USC football fandom.
All right. Well, we tried to say as much as we could about USC-Notre Dame and the series and the thought processes and the calculus and the chess moves. It's not a finalized story. The story has not run its course. We're going to see what USC and Notre Dame ultimately agree on. Obviously, the 16-team playoff format and how that's going to work, that's going to play a role in it. So this is a continuing conversation, but we obviously wanted to spend a considerable amount of time on it because that is the main story for USC football fans, also Notre Dame football fans right now. All right, we're going to play a 1-minute advertisement for a sponsor. Got to pay the bills here at the Voice of College Football. On the other side of the break, an interesting question about USC coaches and the reputation and identity of the program. So here is our 1-minute commercial.
You can make a difference here at the Voice of College Football. Use the Amazon link. Financially contribute to the Voice of College Football without spending a penny. Same shopping experience. It's easy. Go to any video on any channel. Go to the description section and grab the link right next to the capital letters that say Amazon. Use that link and Amazon will instantaneously convert to your account, settings, history, everything intact, just like whatever link you use right now. No difference. Pay no attention to the product that you see right there. Just go search what you want. Don't forget the Amazon link. Thank you for your support. Sincerely, the Voice of College Football.
Okay, a word from our sponsor here at the VOCFB. All right, Ethan. So saw on social media an interesting little comment the other day, just a day or two ago, and it was, Steve Sarkisian, Lane Kiffin. They struggled at USC, but now they're finding their groove. They're succeeding. Obviously, this especially applies to Sark at Texas. And Lincoln Riley's stumbling around. Is there just something in the water in LA, or something about USC that's kind of holding things back? Interesting question, provocative question. Ethan, I think the right point of emphasis would simply be, has Chad Bowden put that issue to bed? Is this an unresolved matter? How would you come at that particular question? That talented coaches didn't make it at USC. They're doing a lot better elsewhere. Has Chad Bowden kind of resolved this already, or do we, is there something about Lincoln Riley that perhaps is kind of perpetuating that kind of question and why people are asking it?
I think that there is a massive culture difference between USC and an SEC school, and I don't think that culture difference is going away anytime soon. And I don't think that it's necessarily a good thing or a bad thing. I think it's just how it is. I think that, LA is just a different atmosphere than anywhere in, the southeastern United States is. And I think that some people step up to that challenge and some people are just really not cut out for it. I think that, but I don't think that it's necessarily a set in stone thing. Like, I think Lincoln Riley may not have been necessarily cut out for it at the beginning, but it's something that you can grow into. And I think that he's made a lot of the right decisions to try to grow into that role. We kind of have talked about how great Lincoln Riley's situation was at Oklahoma and how he was kind of grandfathered into just this wonderful situation, had wonderful relationships with, basically everybody that he needed to have great relationships with at Oklahoma. He was, Bob Stoops' like successor, protege, whatever you want to call him. And then, coming into LA, there's a lot of prominent high school football. We've talked about this a lot in recruiting, a lot of prominent high school football coaches that relationship wasn't automatic. It's had to develop over time. And, Chad Bowden has had a lot more success with that than Lincoln Riley has had historically. I think that, it just goes back to a cultural difference. I read an interesting article that talked about Lane Kiffin recently going on a podcast and talking about how he would walk around campus in LA and at USC and walk around the city in LA and just kind of never be recognized by anybody. And, nobody really recognized him, cared about who he was. There was a lot of students that would just pass by him without even making a second glance. Like, this is their head football coach, one of the most important people at their university, even to their like student life, you would think, like their like experience. If your football team's good, that's like an invaluable experience that you can't really have any other phase of life. Being in college and having a great college football team is, it's one of the greatest experiences I think that anybody can have. I mean, I was at USC in 2022 when they were in competition for a college football playoff berth, and it's not an experience that you can really replace with anything else in the sports world. It's wonderful. And so then he kind of expanded on that whole thing and just kind of, and he's a member of the SEC now, so you can kind of take anything positive that he says about the SEC with a little bit of a grain of salt, but, expanded on the whole, it just means more, and it just seems to mean more to people out here and whatever. And obviously that's going to be just how it is. Cultural differences, LA, the southeastern United States, college football is a lot bigger there. There's a lot more going on in LA. I'm beating a dead horse by bringing up that point. Basically, everybody knows about it. I don't need to bring it up. It's not a new idea. But I do think that some people are more cut out for the challenge that LA poses. I think that Pete Carroll is a great example. Pete Carroll has coached in a lot of challenging cities, USC, LA being one of them, and made a lot of difference on and off the field in those cities. And, Seattle's a decently big city. He's now in Vegas, which is another city with a lot of reputation, a lot of challenges, with a franchise that has a lot of reputation and challenges, and he's not running from that. He never has. And I think that because of some of the successes he's had at USC, I would expect him to have a lot of success in Vegas as well. I think some of these other coaches, honestly, even though, Texas fans and Ole Miss fans are probably talking about college football 24/7 and, probably talking about him 24/7, some of that attention is also positive. They love college football over there. So, if Ole Miss goes 4-8 this year, people will still sell out every game. They'll still show up. They'll show their support. They'll show, positive attention towards the program. Very similar. Texas is a little bit different, a little bit less, supportive, but it's just kind of how it historically has been in the SEC. And I think that just works better for some people. And I think that just not only the culture of the football program, but the culture of the surrounding town, the culture of the college campus, it works better for people. And I think people either, adjust or they find a better situation. And I think that's what it comes down to. I don't think that, there's anything bigger that USC wasn't doing to support them. I don't think that, they were phoning it in at USC. I think that both of them are very good football coaches and they tried. And I think that it was just more difficult than maybe they were ready to handle at that point in time. It's also later in their careers. They have a lot more experience. They've been mentored by a lot more people at this point. So I just think that it's kind of a right place, right time thing, and they're at the right place and at the right time. So that's what I would say about that.
Yeah, I mean, both Sark and Kiffin, they had to go to the Nick Saban rehab facility. They got coached up. They were coached on how to coach, and then they came out on the other side of that ready. So it's not as though Sark and Kiffin were fully formed head coaches, anything but when they were at USC. They needed to go through some tough times. They needed to do things that, frankly, they should have done earlier in their careers, but didn't. The other thing to note here, Ethan, and I'm like your opinion on this. This part of it seems also pretty clear cut to me that, Pat Hayden, Lynn Swann, USC had some bad athletic directors. So it's not as though, everything was just put in place for the football program to succeed. No, there were several years of bad decisions, bad executive maneuverings, like Cliff Kingsbury coming aboard as offensive coordinator, but then he goes to the NFL, not USC and Lynn Swann not being able to retain him. And it's really interesting to wonder, what if Cliff Kingsbury had coached at USC several years before he joined Lincoln Riley's staff? Not that was like the representative example, but it's just one of many, right? Pat Hayden making the decision to hand the keys to Clay Helton, before Christian McCaffrey and Stanford blew the doors off the Trojans. Pat, maybe you should have just waited until that Pac-12 championship game to see if old Clay was really up to it a decade ago. So, Ethan, to me, a large part of this is the athletic director position, and USC didn't begin to rebound until Mike Bohn hired Lincoln Riley. So, a skilled AD making an elite hire that we didn't see under Hayden or Swann. And then Jen Cohen picking up the pieces, getting Chad Bowden aboard and reconstructing things. To me, the athletic director chair is a big reason why USC didn't really hit the mark. It's not just this nebulous, there's something in the water in LA thing. No, there are concrete explanations for why this happened.
Right. I think that you can't say either of these coaches were in a perfect situation when they were hired. And I think it's evident in kind of the ways that both of them ended up being let go. I mean, you go back to Lane Kiffin, he was fired on the tarmac. That's obviously not the most graceful way to let go of a head football coach. And then, when Sark was let go, all these personal details came out about, his struggles with alcoholism, and none of that really should have ever hit the public. I don't think. I think that that's a matter that they should have dealt with a little bit more privately. So there was a lot of different issues going on between the head coach position and everybody above that in the AD position and all that stuff. So it's, I don't think we can look back and blame them for those years of struggle. And I don't think that we should be wishing any ill will towards them. Obviously, we should be hoping to compete against them and beat them if we ever come against them. And, whether it's, like you said, when the Big Ten and SEC seem to inevitably make this partnership and play each other in the regular season, or if it's, we play them in the playoffs at some point. But yeah, I wouldn't really put it on either of them. It's not really either of their faults, for sure.
All right. We alluded to a guy named Pete Carroll earlier in the show. So for our final segment here on tonight's show here at the Voice of College Football, I'm going to talk some Pete Carroll, because a week ago, and this was last Wednesday, the NFL 2025 schedule dropped. So the schedule release was 2 hours before Ethan and I went on the air last week. So not enough time for us to just, scramble and whip something up. We wanted to take a week, think about the schedule, look at it, study it, and come up with our opinions on what we forecast and what we think it might be kind of the pivotal moments, the pivotal elements of this Las Vegas Raiders schedule for 2025. So Ethan, as we look at the schedule, week 1 at the Patriots, week 2 in the What's Your Deal Bowl, Pete Carroll against Jim Harbaugh. They're going to have some fun with the Chargers and the Raiders, but that is the Monday night. It's actually Monday night, week 2 is a doubleheader Buccaneers are the first game, and then Chargers Raiders are the second game on September 15th. Then a trip to the NFC runner-up Washington Commanders in week 3. Pete Carroll versus Caleb Williams and the Chicago Bears in week 4. So just kind of mentioning the first few games in the schedule. You can obviously look up the full schedule on your own computer, but Ethan, a lot of really sexy games and storylines. I mean, Pete Carroll against Jim Harbaugh, Pete Carroll against Caleb Williams, and of course Pete Carroll trying to blunt the Kansas City Chiefs and their dynastic run in the AFC West. Like he's now in the AFC. Lots of different dynamics compared to what he had with the Seattle Seahawks. Your impressions of this schedule, some of your general notes, will obviously follow up with a few more in-depth items.
I think it's honestly a decently favorable schedule for the Raiders. I think that their fans often complain that there's some sort of scheduling curse against them, that they seem to always get the short end of the stick, but they can't really complain about that this year. I mean, they play a lot of opponents that weren't necessarily the best teams in 2024. You mentioned the Patriots, the Bears weren't great. The Titans obviously ended up getting the number 1 overall pick. They play the Jaguars. The Cowboys weren't good. The Browns weren't good. And they play the Giants as well. So that's honestly half the schedule of teams that were at the, kind of the cellar of the league in 2024. Obviously the Raiders can be counted among those teams. So it's not like, we have seen the Raiders prove that they can consistently beat teams of that caliber, but it's not the least favorable schedule in the world. I think that it's, they should be excited in Vegas about the potential that, for what Vegas can do with the schedule. I think that I saw that, the travel schedule too is decently favorable for them as well. It's not, there's not a bunch of crazy long road trips and they finish out the season with a couple of home games. So generally it's decently favorable. So nothing to complain about there from a Raider fan's perspective. I think a couple of games that stand out to me, like you said, their second game against the Chargers. I have loved watching Pete Carroll and Jim Harbaugh's rivalry over the years. It obviously goes back to USC and Stanford. The main format in which I watched it was when they were the Niners and Seahawks coaches. And it was Pete Carroll just generally always kind of stepped it up in those rivalry divisional games. So I think that the added significance of them being divisional rivals again is really exciting. So that's a game that I have circled on my calendar if I'm a Raiders fan for sure. There's also a potential reunion of Pete versus Russell Wilson. If Russell Wilson somehow is the starter in December, then he will obviously play against a Pete Carroll coached Raiders team when the Giants visit Vegas on December 27th. And then, you mentioned week 1 with the game against the Patriots. There's obviously still a lot of bad blood between those teams because of the Tuck Rule game and, just kind of some historic rivalry there. There's also Tom Brady being involved in purchasing, part of the Raiders and obviously being a former Patriot. So there's some significance there as well. So those are the games that I definitely have circled. And then you mentioned the Chiefs, and kind of going back to what I said about Pete Carroll just stepping it up in those divisional games. I am by no means a fan of the Chiefs. I have rooted against them in pretty much every single Super Bowl they've played in. The players on the teams are not my favorite personalities. It's safe to say that I don't like them. So I'm hoping that I can watch the Raiders, kind of surprise the Chiefs in at least one of the games. In a perfect world, they do it in both from my perspective, but in at least one of the games, because I'd be so excited to see the Raiders scoring a late touchdown and just panning to Pete Carroll with his trademark excited, positive energy, pumping everybody up. And Andy Reid just kind of dumbfounded on the other sideline, like so many other coaches have been coaching against Pete Carroll over the years. So that would be kind of the pinnacle of the Raiders season for me, if I get to see that. But yeah, a lot to look forward to, honestly, and a lot to be optimistic about.
All right, let's pick our most important Raiders games that are not AFC West games, because AFC West games, of course, 2 against the Chiefs, 2 against Jim Harbaugh and the Bolts, 2 against the Denver Broncos, who are a playoff team a year ago. Obviously, those 6, it goes without saying, those are really important. Your 2 biggest non AFC West games in the Raiders' schedule. I'm going to get the 2 that I have. Week 5 at the Indianapolis Colts, and Week 11 on Monday night against the Dallas Cowboys. I think that, if you're a team in the Raiders' position, where your goal is not to win the AFC West, your goal is not to make the Super Bowl this year. I mean, being realistic, like the Raiders are not a Super Bowl contender. Their goal is to make the playoffs. That's their realistic, attainable goal. So you're trying to get at least to 9-8, hopefully 10-7. That's the realistic goal this year for the Raiders under Pete Carroll. To get to that kind of record, you need to win the road games that you're expected to win, and you need to take care of like middle tier, relatively equally talented teams at home. And so at the Colts in Week 5, that's going to be early October, and then home against Dallas in the middle of November on Monday night. To me, Pete Carroll and the Raiders need to win those 2 games. If they do, they have a decent shot of being 9-8 and being in that playoff hunt until the final week. Your 2 biggest non-AFC West games for Pete Carroll this year with the Raiders.
Well, I agree wholeheartedly on the Cowboys game. That was also one that I kind of had noted and circled because I think I kind of have a similar opinion on, that's a game you're getting to the middle of the season there. And I don't expect the Raiders starting poorly. I think if they're going to miss the playoffs, it's going to be because of a mid or late season collapse, in my opinion, because I think that they have early season games against the Patriots and the Bears and the Titans. I think they win 2 to 3 of those games for sure. And then I think that they definitely get at least one against either the Chargers, the Commanders, or the Colts. So I think, you're going into that game with 3 or 4 wins. You're probably kind of right in the middle. Sorry, excuse me. That's a little bit later in the season. But you have at least 3 or 4 wins there. There's a couple more games. Another winnable one against the Jaguars, another winnable one against the Broncos. Not obviously guaranteed. They probably don't win both of those, but they're winnable. So I think you come up to the Cowboys game with like 5 or 6 wins, but also probably around the same amount of losses. So that's kind of a pivotal, like you said, primetime game, a little bit of a different schedule. So they have to be prepared for that. So I think that is one that I had circled as well. In terms of the earlier season game that I had circled, I was a week earlier than you, and I had the Bears circled over the Colts, only because I think the Bears and the Raiders are both going to be in somewhat of a position where that's going to be an important game for them, because either they're both going to start fast and they're going to want to keep that momentum going, or they're both going to start slow, and this is going to be when it gets to week 4, especially if either team is 0-3, that's when you start panicking about this could be a lost season. This could be another season where we miss the playoffs. These are a lot of franchises who have had a lot of recent frustrations. These are franchises who have made big splashy acquisitions in the last couple of years recently. And, the added significance of a Caleb Williams versus Pete Carroll, and the added significance of it being at home, because Mark Davis has been really insistent on making sure that Allegiant Stadium is a more hostile environment for, opposing teams, and is a more just generally desirable location for Vegas fans, and for, even if they're not Raider fans, just like football fans in Vegas to come to and spend their Sunday. So, and people are going to show up for the home opener against the Chargers, to see Harbaugh versus Pete Carroll, just because it's the home opener. There's always the added hype, but you kind of need to retain that fan attendance week 2, again, build momentum, show these fans at least one win in the first 2 games to keep them wanting to come back. So I was a little bit earlier than you, but I think we're right on the same page in terms of, around week 4, 5, 6, there's like the first pinch, and then later in the season, there's a potential second one where, they can't fall apart mid-season and they can't fall apart at the end of the season, or it's going to be another, season with a lot more losses than wins on the record for sure.
One interesting note from my perspective on this Pete Carroll Raiders schedule and journey in 2025, you referenced how you don't really like the Chiefs, and most people don't. Most people outside of Kansas City don't. But it's interesting that if you were to tell me, Ethan, right now, the Chiefs get the number 1 seed in the AFC, I would respond to that by saying, you know what? The odds of the Raiders and Pete Carroll making the playoffs are higher as a result of that. Now, you might wonder, why would that be? Here's why. Chiefs at Raiders, week 18. If the Chiefs have the 1 seed wrapped up through week 17, they're going to rest their starters. And there's very immediate precedent for this, right? Last season, Chiefs had it all wrapped up. They go to Denver and, division game, division rivals, but the Chiefs did not want anything to do with the Cincinnati Bengals and Joe Burrow being in the playoffs as the number 7 seed, a possible divisional round opponent. The Chiefs just treated that like, like the AFC NFC Hall of Fame game in late July, early August. This was like a B squad spring training game. Broncos absolutely annihilate the Chiefs. So weirdly, the Raiders and Chiefs are ancient rivals going back to the AFL in the 1960s. But if the Chiefs are awesome this year, not just good, but awesome, like if they're 15-1 through their first 16 games, that's probably good for the Raiders because it means the Chiefs rest everybody that final week 18 game, and that could be the difference between the Raiders making the playoffs and not in year 1 under Pete Carroll. So, final item on the show, Ethan, your prediction for the Raiders record under Pete Carroll in this 2025 NFL season.
I'm going to go 7-10. I think that there's at least 8 or 9 very winnable games on the schedule for the Raiders, and I think that they'll get most of them, but not all of them. I think every NFL season there's a couple of wins that surprise us and a couple of losses that also surprise us. So I think 7 wins is a reasonable prediction, and I think that that's a sizable improvement from the past year. It'll keep them at least interesting in the last couple of weeks, keep the fans invested, and give them a good building block heading into 2026.
Okay, I think we agree on the 40,000 foot view that this looks like a 7 to 9 win team. I think 7 wins is the floor. I think 10 wins is the ceiling. I'm coming in at 9-8. I think the Raiders can kind of win those middle tier battleground games. They'll win at least a few in the AFC West to keep themselves afloat. And I do think that the Chiefs are going to rest everybody in week 18 because the Chiefs have the number 1 seed wrapped up. So that's an extra one that you can't really count on now, but I'm projecting ahead that the Chiefs will get the 1 seed. They will rest everybody, and that might be what enables the Raiders to get to 9-8. I guess one other item, just while we're talking about the Raiders and Pete Carroll. Do you get the sense, talking about Pete Carroll now in Las Vegas, that there are more USC people rooting for him? Not that they necessarily weren't rooting for him in Seattle, but that being in Las Vegas and coaching against, the Chargers, they used to be in San Diego. So if you're in Los Angeles, like you didn't want San Diego to enjoy anything. Is Pete Carroll, by virtue of being situated in Las Vegas, do you sense more Pete Carroll enthusiasm now that he's down in Las Vegas, closer to Southern California, as opposed to being stuck way up there in Seattle? Any sense of how that dynamic is working in your estimation?
I think so. I think that the Raiders obviously historically have been a franchise that's been located in LA for a number of years, and they have a pretty large LA fan base. I would say that their LA fan base at this point is almost at the same size or potentially even bigger than their fan base that they've expanded in Vegas. So there's a lot of fans down here. And I would assume that if you're not a USC Raiders, a USC Raider fan, that you at least have friends that are USC Raider fans. And so, yeah, I would assume that has helped for sure. There's too much history for it not to be the case.
All right, folks. Well, when Ethan and I gather next Wednesday night here at the Voice of College Football on USC Trojans Primetime Live, will we have resolution with the USC-Notre Dame series? Will we have resolution with the college football playoff, its future format. Stay tuned. But anyway, you can catch us at 10 p.m. in the East, 7 p.m. Pacific every Wednesday night. And obviously, we invite you to watch Coliseum Chronicles, the Tuesday night show here at the USC channel at the Voice of College Football. And as you can see on our little banner there, we have bonus cuts, bonus segments, memberships available at different tiers. And be sure to like, subscribe, and share our videos on YouTube to support the USC channel. It's the off season, but hey, Big Ten Media Days are going to be here before you know it. Like it's just about 2 months away. It's football just right around the corner. It's kind of crazy how quickly it's sneaking up on us. So do what you can to support the USC channel here at the Voice of College Football. For Ethan Inman, I'm Matt Zemek. We'll see you here next Wednesday.